Hello everybody, Tyranno here, and welcome back to another episode of my proposed International Tank Tech Tree series. Haven't done one of these episodes in a little while, or I haven't actually done any episodes in a little while. As some of you know, I've been doing tests for the last month or so, and revision before that. But finally finished all the tests, possibly resets might come up, hopefully not. But, I've got time to do these episodes now, and finally get back to replying to all your comments on the previous episodes. Now, in today's episode, we're looking at potential Belgian tanks in the International Tank Tech Tree. But before we look at the tanks, we'll just give a little bit of background information on Belgium in the war. It had suffered massively during World War One, where a lot of Belgian territory had been occupied by the Germans. There had been lots of fighting over it, and the country generally suffered quite a bit. And it had actually gone into a alliance with the French, but in 1936 they had abandoned this and gone back to neutrality. It actually ended up kind of repeating like World War One. Belgium went to neutrality. Germany ended up invading through it. Allies moved in, except unlike with World War One, the Allies were beaten. They had, France surrendered and Britain had to retreat back to Dunkirk and back to Britain. The Belgian army fought bravely, but at the end of the day, it didn't have enough men or equipment to be able to stop the German panzers, and it also fell victim to new weapons of warfare. For example, at the Fort Eben Emael, 1,200 troops had been defeated by 80 via the use of gliders and shaped charges, for only 6 lost on the German side. Belgium just wasn't able to stand up to the assault by the panzers and paratroopers. It was just, like I said, it was a small army. It had good equipment, but not enough of it. Nonetheless, Belgium still managed to contribute massively to the Allied cause. There were 3 Belgian forces. The Belgian Congo had stayed loyal to the Allied cause and kept on fighting, and it provided many rare resources, for example gold, rubber and uranium, much of which was used in the Manhattan Project. Unless I'm misremembering, I believe most of the uranium used in the atomic bombs dropped on Japan was actually from the Congo. So that was a massive contribution by Belgium to the war effort, even after the country itself had been occupied. Because Belgium was a neutral country and focused on a mainly defensive army, it didn't really invest that much in tanks. It had tanks called the T-15, but as far as I'm aware, these were only really armed with heavy machine guns. The only other tanks capable of taking on German panzers were the ACG-1, of which it only had about 10 or 11, and was actually a French tank, and the T-13 tank destroyers, both of which we'll look at in this episode. After the war, Belgium joined NATO, and it used a variety of different equipment provided by other NATO countries, for example Britain, America, France and West Germany, and it got a lot of equipment from those countries, but it did produce at least one vehicle domestically, or converted domestically, which we'll also be covering later in this episode, the Cat-90. So hopefully that gives you a little basic background information onto what was happening with Belgium before, during and after World War II, with regards to tanks and military history. But without further ado, let's get straight into the episode. Now the first tank we're looking at is the ACG-1, otherwise known as the AMC-35. Now the AMC-35 is a French tank, and like I said, it was also known as the ACG-1, but some of them were actually sold to Belgium. The tank in the picture is actually a French AMC-35, because Belgium only actually got something like 11 of them, because the delivery caused all sorts of problems politically. It was seen as provoking Germany for some reason, and as far as I can tell, they were all destroyed in the war, so there aren't actually any left to get pictures of. I couldn't find any pictures from the time either, or not any good pictures at least. Now, the reason I've put the Belgian vehicle as a separate vehicle from the French one is because it had a different turret. Now, the turret itself wasn't actually that different, but it actually used a Belgian 47mm gun, which was slightly smaller in length than the French 47mm gun. Now, looking online, because my books don't actually list the Belgian gun, I managed to find the following penetration characteristics. 40mm at 600 metres, which is pretty good and puts it on par with the Russian 45mm guns. Now, there was also some tests done by the Hungarians who got their hands on some of the guns from the Germans. I'm not including them because the figures are, quite frankly, kind of ridiculous compared to the War Thunder figures. Something like 51mm penetration at 60 degrees at 100 metres, which is almost as good as the Russian 85mm gun. So I'm not including them. Either War Thunder's got its figures wrong, or the Hungarians got theirs wrong, because it shouldn't be performing almost as good as Tier 4 tanks. So I'm not going to include them when choosing battle rating and stuff. But moving on to the armour, the ACG-1 had about 25mm of armour. So that's reasonably well protected. I mean, you can see a little bit of sloping on the front, so I suppose that's reasonably well protected. Should be able to take a few shots from long range at least, from lower caliber weapons. Speed-wise, it could do about 26 miles per hour on the road, I believe about 20 miles per hour off-road, so it's not particularly a slow tank either. Crew, it only actually had 3 crew, a driver, a commander and a gunner. Well, this is actually better than a lot of previous French tanks, because before, a lot of them had only had one person in the turret, the commander, so having a commander and a gunner was actually a bit of a step up compared to some of the earlier designs. So where should this tank go in the tech tree? Now, I've put it in Tier 1, just behind the AMC-35. But battle rating wise, probably 1.7 or 1.3. I don't know if it'll have the same battle rating as the AMC-35. That may have a higher one, it may have a lower one, probably higher if anything. But 1.7 would put it a little bit below the Panzer IIIF, just below the Panzer IVe. 1.3 would actually put it right at the bottom of the tech tree, alongside the Panzer 38T and the Panzer IV-C. The Panzer IIIe is actually 2.0 and has better penetration characteristics, I believe. 52mm at 500 metres. So, 1.7 or 1.3 is where I would put it personally. I think it would do reasonably well there. It'd have to be Tier 1, definitely. Can't go any higher than that. So overall, it's a nice little tank, and I think it would do very good in the international tech tree. Of course, not as a high priority, because, of course, the French had the AMC-35 with the French turret and French gun. It's a bit confusing, because Belgium actually ended up using it in combat more than the French. The French only used it, at the very end of the Battle of France, while Belgium used theirs, straight from the start. So, but at the end of the day, I do consider it mainly a French vehicle, so if I had to choose priority, I would say the AMC-35. But, I think this should be added at some point for the international tech tree. Now, the next vehicle we're looking at is the T-13 tank destroyer, of which there's 3 basic variants, the B1, B2 and B3. In this picture you can see the B2, and the next picture will be the B3. Basically, Belgium had ordered artillery tractors to tow around 75mm guns. And at some point they had decided to actually put a gun on the tractors, in this case the 47mm gun. And this was reasonably successful. Because of the weight of the gun and how the vehicle was designed, the actual gun had to be pointed rearwards, and it unfortunately had very limited traverse, only something like 100 degrees, because the only way to actually protect the gunners and the driver was to have these armoured shields that could be deployed and undeployed. They could be undeployed to give 360-degree fire, but obviously this exposed the gun crew. However, the armour wasn't actually that good. It was only something like 6 to 12mm, so perhaps it wasn't going to be that useful anyway, except for against small arms fire. There was also a Browning automatic rifle as a secondary armament. Speed-wise, it was quite fast. If I can find the speed, about 24.8 miles an hour, so, quite fast vehicle, considering, it's an artillery tractor with a huge gun on top. But once the B1 had been tested, they decided to move on to the B2. Now, the B2 was similar to the B1. There weren't that many changes. It had the same gun, same speed, same armour, same crew, commander to find a gun, loader and driver. But it did have some changes to the suspension. It had a slightly lower silhouette from the front, I believe. And after the B2 had been put into production, they moved on to the B3, which was quite a bit different. For one, they used a different vehicle for the conversion process. They used the Vickers Carden Lloyd Light Dragon Mark IIB light tank. Obviously, this is going to be, stronger and better than a artillery tractor, and, it was a massive improvement over the previous vehicle. Now, the B3 was obviously a massive change because of the new vehicle, and massive improvements were incorporated into it. It still used a 47mm gun, but it had a rotating turret. So, better able to actually turn and engage enemy targets. And as you can see in the picture here, they've got rid of the gun shields. They've actually put armour around the gun. And the crew can all, being accommodated inside the actual vehicle itself rather than being exposed on the outside. Although there is still that gap at the back. The armour itself was a tiny bit thicker, 7 to 13 millimeters, up from 6 to 12, which is better than nothing, but it's not really much for change. Speed was also improved to about 25.5 miles an hour, so faster, ever so slightly more protected, and better able to engage targets. Also had 4 crewmen as well, rather than 3, so it had the gunner, loader, commander, and driver, so the commander could actually focus on commanding rather than having to fire the gun, which can now be done by the gunner. The B3 became the most produced variant of all of the T13s, with something like 200 to 250 being built. I think the B1s and B2s only had 50 built altogether, but not all of them were delivered, but, there was a decent amount of them around. I think I've got written down 150 in The Fall of France, Disaster in the West by George Forty and John Duncan, so at least 150. I've seen online sources saying there was about 200 around of all variants, so there was quite a lot of them, and as far as I can tell, they all acquitted themselves rather well in the Battle of Belgium or Battle of France, able to deal with most German tanks, or pretty much all German tanks, and, doing so on multiple occasions. So where should these tanks go on the tech tree? Definitely Tier 1. Battle rating wise, I believe the B1 and B2, if they're both implemented, should go about 1 to 1.3. They shouldn't be any higher than 1.7, certainly, and shouldn't be higher than the ACG-1, because that has the same gun. And the gun is very good, but obviously it's not very well protected. And obviously the limited traverse. It depends what happens with the armoured shields. If they're deployed, you've got the limited traverse, and I don't know if you could undeploy them in the middle of a battle. So that would affect things a lot. The B3's got ever slightly better armour, rotating turret, more crew, 1.7 to 1.3, I'd say. No higher than that. It'd be able to do very well at that battle rating. Wouldn't be... Its armour would be a disadvantage, but the gun, it'd be very well, or very good. Should be able to perform very well from ambush positions. It should do very good in the game. So as you can see, the Belgians did have some very nice tank destroyers. The B3 is especially good, but the B1 and B2, they should be good enough as well. It would be very nice to see these incorporated in the lower tiers. I think they'd be a very good addition for the international tech tree. You could probably miss out the B2 or the B1 if you really needed to, but I do, or at least temporarily, but I do hope to see them all included in War Thunder at some point in the future. Now, the next vehicle has caused me a lot of confusion. It's the KT-90, otherwise, well, it stands for the Canon Anti-Tank d'Infanterie Automateur 90mm. Now, as you can see, it's got a 90mm gun on it, which is good, but there's a bit of confusion about what chassis it was built on. My book, The World's Armoured Fighting Vehicles, which is a translated book from General von Senger and Ettelin, says it was built on a universal carrier chassis, which is the Bren carrier. But all of the online sources say it was built on a Lloyd carrier chassis. I think it was built on the Lloyd carrier chassis, personally, looking at, comparing the Lloyd and the Bren carriers, so I'll probably be quoting from the Lloyd carrier for, stats and stuff like that. Now, the Lloyd carrier could do about 30 miles per hour, which is pretty fast on, I think this was on the road, but, still pretty fast. But it only had 7mm of armour. Now, I don't know if the Belgians added any armour to the Catty tank destroyer, because all my book says is, quote, the protection of this vehicle is effective only at a range of approximately 900 yards, unquote. Now, like I said, this was a translated book, so I don't know if this is a translation error. It doesn't say what it's protected from. It doesn't actually say anything about the armour other than that, so I can only assume it means from small arms fire or something like that. It's the only way it makes sense to me. I also tried to find information about the 90mm gun. Now, my book says it's a Makar anti-tank gun. Unfortunately, Makar doesn't make guns anymore. They make ammunition for guns made by Cockerill, I believe. And I couldn't find much information. Obviously, I wasn't going to use their modern ammunition as a, for penetration characteristics. But eventually I found some information saying it could do about 350mm penetration with high explosive anti-tank, which is, very good. That puts it in tier 5, definitely, especially since it's a post-war tank. Now, one other strength of this tank destroyer, well, it's not even a tank destroyer, as my book says, it was just meant to be a mobile anti-tank gun. But as I was saying, it's only 5 foot tall, which is about 1.5 meters. This is actually smaller than the Hetzer, which is something like 7 feet tall. So this would be very good in ambushes, where its light armour isn't going to be much of a problem. So I think this would be a very good ambushing vehicle. So where should this vehicle go in the tech tree? Well, like I said earlier, tier 5. It's a very powerful vehicle. It's got a very powerful gun. It has to go tier 5. Battle rating, honestly, anywhere between 7 and 8. I'd probably nearer to battle rating 8, but, anywhere between 7 and 8 would be good. 7.78 probably would be preferable. I think this would be a very good vehicle to have in the game. It's definitely unusual, and it would allow Belgium to represent itself in the higher tiers, because at the moment we've only looked at lower tier vehicles. Plus, it would also give a massive boost to the tank destroyer vehicles in the international tank tech tree in the higher tiers. And yeah, I think it would be a very good vehicle to have in the game. So now that we've looked at potential Belgian tanks that could be included in War Thunder, how can Belgium contribute with regards to events and realistic battles and simulator battles? Well, the most obvious event I can think of is the Battle of Belgium. Germany is invading, and you have to use Belgian vehicles to stop them, possibly with French or British help, depending on how it goes. So you'd get a lot of Belgian vehicles being used there against German tanks. Other events could include perhaps vehicles have been hidden away by the resistance and are coming out to help the Allies as they drive through Belgium in 1944 and 1945. Perhaps some can be used by the German army in their events to represent captured vehicles used against the Russians and Allies. Potentially we could have alternate history, where maybe Belgium allied with the Germans and against the French, or maybe there was some sort of united Europe going against Russia or Britain or America. Another fairly obvious event would be NATO versus Warsaw Pact. The Cold War's gone hot in the late 50s, in which case we could use the KT-90 to represent Belgium's contribution to the NATO forces. Overall, I think Belgium would be a very nice country to have in the game. It's got very good vehicles, not many, but very, they're high quality. The sorts of events they could be included in, and I think they'd be a very good fit for War Thunder overall. And I do hope that Belgium and the vehicles it used will be added to War Thunder in the future. So that's it for today's episode. I hope you enjoyed it. Hopefully it's given you a bit of an insight into what potential Belgian vehicles we could get in an international tank tech tree. Personally, I'm looking forward to the KT-90 and the T-13B3 the most. They're the ones that sort of jump out as the most unusual to me and, most effective. But I'm looking forward to all of the Belgian vehicles. And like I said, I hope you enjoyed the episode. If you did, then subscribe, leave a like, leave feedback. Could always do with more feedback. Thanks for watching. I'll see you next time. And if you liked that episode, then don't forget to click the pictures to check out even more Tank Tech Tree episodes.